In this video, I'm going to share with you some of the techniques and tips that I have learned to help me remember the Bible verse addresses. It's a formula that has helped me memorize the entire 404 verses of the book of Revelation, Psalm 119, and countless others. It's not necessarily a word-for-word memorization because there are so many translations, but very close. The 23rd Psalm, for example, perhaps you know it. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. But if I asked you to go to verse 4, could you do it without starting from the beginning? Well, each Bible verse is numbered within a chapter and a verse. So you need a chapter and a verse image. And based on the major system and an incredible amount of imagination and using your brain to create stories, I promise you by the end of this video, well, maybe running back a couple times, you'll be able to do the 23rd Psalm forward and backwards or out of order. The trick is you have to make a distinction between your chapter character numbers and your verse character numbers. And a word of caution, when you come up with numbers, which we'll talk about, you must keep them distinct. Don't mix up a chapter image for a verse image. Trust me. If you're not a great artist, nouns are the easiest to draw, but there are plenty other opportunities to show you. Basically, the major systems, you take numbers, turning them into letters, turning them into words, turning them into images or pictures to make up a story. So each number has a specific voiced or unvoiced sound option, and there will be no vowels used. And there are literally hundreds of options for various numbers, like 7, but in this one video, we're only going to just stick with 2. So a brief overview of the major system. 1 is always a T or a D sound. For my chapters, I often use the do character. For my verses, I use a tie character. 2 is a turn upside down, and it's an N sound. For my chapter characters, I often use the wildebeest, a nu. For my verses, I always get in my head an Uno card, or a deck of them. 3, turn it upside down, it's the sign of M sound. For my chapter verses, I use a mayo jar, or for my verses, I often use an emu. For the number 4 is always the R sound, and you can remember it's the last letter how you spell it. For my chapter verses, I use a kangaroo, and for my verses, I use an arrow, and even though it's 2 R's, it's only 1 sound. L is number 5, and for my chapters, I often use a whale. I don't use the consonant sounds beforehand. For my verses, I use oil, and you'll see how this works great in this example, or an owl for my verses. 6 has a few different options of the sh, ch, or j sound. And for my chapter verses, I like to use which, often, especially in Revelation. For verses, I often use a shoe. For the letter 7, it's either a K or a hard G sound, as in G. Turn it back to back, it kind of looks like a K. So for chapters, I often use an egg, or for my verses, I use a key. When it comes to the letter 8, it's a F or a V sound. And for my chapters, I often use a UFO, which is great, again, for Revelation. And for my verses, I use the ivy. 9 has the B or P sound. It looks like it. For my chapter, I use a spider web, and I use my verses for a boy, usually a blue stick figure. 0 has an S or a Z sound like ice or house. Then you can take those numbers and combine them. So 19 would be, for my chapters, I use a top or a TP often. For my verses, I use a tuba often. Don't worry about if you don't quite get this right yet. Just realize that you're using the consonants. And an app that is really helpful and has done all the work for you is the Numsy. Again, I suggest using nouns because they're much easier to make a picture of. So for the 23rd Psalm, combining them, I'm using my main character as a gnome. And if it was a verse, sometimes an enema, which I won't be using in this video. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So for my first chapter character, he's a gnome, and you see around those little sheep in the pasture a red necktie. He makes me lay down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. So I have my gnome, which is my chapter character, but laying down with his Uno cards. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. I have my gnome next to the path where my emu is, who it's the verse 3. And there's a girl actually in a shoe store, and shoes have soles, to help me remember the 3rd. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. I've got the picture of my gnome in this death valley, and the arrow is showing the way, and I even have a rod and a staff in the picture. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup runneth over. I have my gnome at a lovely table with an owl, which is a verse 5, and to top it off, I've got a cup of oil being poured on his head. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I have my chapter gnome figure with the shoe bringing up following goodness and mercy. Review this and check out these pictures, put some action into it, and try it backwards and forwards, or just odd verses, or just even verses. God will bless your efforts.